Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. For years, he stalked elementary schools, neighborhoods, and playgrounds looking for young girls to abduct, rape, and murder. As though invisible, he brazenly struck in broad daylight, pulling children into his van or cars, or he crept into homes in the dead of night to carry away little girls while their families slept. He was the boogeyman they warned their children about, disguised as the friendly stranger, the fiend who lurked in the shadows outside of bedroom windows. From the New York Times bestselling author of Monster and No Stone Unturned comes the incredible cold case manhunt of one of America's most horrific serial killers. The book that we are profiling this evening is Boogeyman, with my special guest, journalist and author, Steve Jackson. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Steve Jackson.
Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, finally we get you on, and as I mentioned a few times, this is True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the kinds of books and stories that we have this evening really live up to that moniker. So let's get right to this. Tell us, our audience, without giving too much of the story away at all, why you became involved with this story in particular, what compelled you about this story, why did you want to write Boogeyman?
Well, this story initially is centered around one of the detectives in it, a detective out of Garland, Texas, named Gary Sweet. And I had actually been working on a different story, a different case, in which he was the main detective, and just started talking to him about some of his other cases. He's a very well-known cold case detective down in Texas, very quiet, very humble man, but his peers know him for what he is. And anyway, he had mentioned his work, and several other people actually had mentioned, talked to Gary about this case that he worked on for 7 years, I believe. So we started talking about it, and I was intrigued both because of the nature of the killer and how long he had gone without being made accountable for some of his crimes. But as I started looking into the story became about, so often detectives and police officers, we only hear about the bad apples and the guys who don't do their job or do their job incorrectly, and we don't hear about some of these detectives who will put 7 years of their lives and if you think about it, all that time away from their families and their focus is on these sorts of things. And Gary Sweet is, if you're going to talk about police officers and detectives, he's one of those guys that you hope is out there when you have some trouble. He's your modern version of a knight in shining armor who is trying to do his best against what he sees as, or saw at the time, was pure evil.
Now, I really, really love the way you set up this book because a lot of true crime, there's a lot of foregone conclusion. There's a lot that basically the audience that might pick up the book might know. This book is incredible in terms of the mystery, and you keep the reader on edge throughout this. And so let's get right to this. And I really love how you lay this out. We first get introduced to Bob Holloman and Bruce Bradshaw. And again, you're right. The perspective, it comes from these police, and we really get inside these police officers' lives and also see the toll that being a really great cop, a person that takes their work home with them, it's a dangerous thing as well. But let's get to Bob Holloman and Bruce Bradshaw and Linda Meeks and Mesquite Police Department. Let's talk about Christy Meeks and Tiffany Easter. Let's talk about the first murder that we encounter and the first police officers that we encounter, the detectives that are brought in this case.
Well, in January 1985, this particular date, the 19th, kind of a nice day down there for a January in Mesquite, Texas, sunny and bright and warm, and people are outside. And Linda Meeks, the mother, is inside of her home cooking dinner. She's a divorced wife, and her children had been off to see their father for the weekend, and they were back, and so she's getting dinner ready, and Christy Meeks, who is I believe 5 years old at the time, and her brother and another young girl, Tiffany Easter, are outside playing, just like any number of other kids were that day. And people are, I mean, it's not one of those things where it's a kid alone in a park after dark or something like that. It's broad daylight. Lots of people around, and suddenly Tiffany Easter and the brother come rushing in to say that some man had approached them and offered cookies, and Christy had unfortunately gone off with this man right in front of who knows how many people, and she disappeared. So Linda Meeks, of course, calls the police department and says, you know, I have this report. And so Bob Holloman and Bruce Bradshaw were both working for the Mesquite Police Department in their crimes against children and also sexual assault crimes, and they get called into this. They're both at home enjoying time with their own kids. They're fairly young detectives at this time, and so they have some young families, and part of that is, of course, what pays a great toll on these guys is that they have children that are in that same age group at the time this happens, when Christy disappears. And she literally just disappears in front of hundreds of people who happen to be out that day. And so they both respond to this call for this missing child, both thinking that, as is typical, the child will show up having wandered down the block or over to a neighbor's house or something like that. But it becomes apparent that something else has happened, that she's been abducted.
Now, Christy's brother, Michael, he's 7 years old, but he seemed to be traumatized and not really able to be questioned and get any information from him. But Tiffany Easter, who's 9 years old, ends up being at least able to answer questions and seems to be able to give a description. So what description does she give, and what other information are police able to get from her?
Well, she basically says that this guy, he's kind of nondescript, and maybe that's why he fit in so well. He's so 5'10", 160 pounds, white male, longish brown hair, but not so long that you'd say, well, he's got really long hair, or so short that you'd say something else. He's got long bangs across his forehead. So he's not all that descript. It's not until actually a couple of months later, when they get a police artist on this, that she suddenly remembers he had a large mole on his face above his right eyebrow, which becomes an important detail in this case. But Tiffany's able to give a description of this man, and the officers canvassing the neighborhood are also able to find a couple of young Hispanic boys, and One of them remembers her getting into a car. They weren't sure on the color. It was a sedan, small sedan of some sort, and they say either gray or yellow, or maybe gray with a yellow racing stripe, or these are small children, and they're the only witnesses, surprisingly, on this day.
Right. So how do police then proceed with this case?
Well, it becomes a big hunt, a search. The neighborhood turns out hundreds of people actually are out looking. Many more police officers are pulled into the case to canvass the neighborhood and looking for any other witnesses. The two officers you'd mentioned, Bob Holloman and Bruce Bradshaw, they essentially went home long enough to pick up warmer clothes, and they stayed out all night, searching fields and culverts and going house to house, and this goes on for a number of days until essentially she's disappeared. It's in broad daylight with all these people around. This girl got into a car with this man and disappeared from her family and from her friends, from her community, and the community was pretty much left with no answers, a big hole on what could have happened. And of course, as you can imagine, you have children, they're out in the yard, they're playing, and yet somebody can walk up, take this child, and disappear without a trace. The police officers, Bob Holloman and Bruce Bradshaw, of course, stayed on it. These are the days. This is 1985, so these are the days before sex offender registries and all these sorts of things. So they're doing their best to track down all the sex offenders in the area, and they actually have some guys they think may be good for it, but none of them turn out. None of them work. And they keep working the case, but it grows colder and colder.
Now, in April, some fishermen discover at Lake Texoma, about 75 miles north of Mesquite. Tell us what they find.
Well, at first, when they are in their boat, they spot what they believe is a large bird dead in the water, and as they come closer, they find it's the body of a small child, and the child is taken to the coroner's office. And at that time, the decomposition is such that they actually believe the child was a boy, but there are some identifying clothing and other markers that eventually they figure out the body belonged to Christy Meeks.
And is there any indication how she was killed? What's the state of decomposition? We know that DNA evidence was still in its infancy at that time. Tell us the state of forensic advancement at that time and what they could derive from the body at that point.
There wasn't much. As you stated, the forensic sciences, or especially in DNA, were in their the early stages at that point, and being able to, especially a body that had obviously been in the water for, well, as we know now, had been in the water for almost 4 months, did not have anything that they could at that time find on the body that would link to a killer. They knew she hadn't been shot and she hadn't been stabbed. There were no ligature marks as far as like from a rope or that sort of thing. So the belief was that she had been asphyxiated or strangled or possibly drowned.
Now, the detectives, just like we see on television, it's amazing some of the stuff, almost fictional in your book. They attend the funeral, observe the funeral, the gravesite. Tell us how far these detectives go in terms of trying every possible angle to address.
Right, and at that time, because some of the sciences were a little bit farther behind, they're doing more of the old-fashioned gumshoe stuff, which is there are cases in which serial killers of a sort they attend the funeral. They get sort of a kick out of that, or they want to come and commune with the dead later on. We all know that there are a lot of twisted minds out there with these sorts of guys. So they actually, the day of the memorial service, those detectives, Holloman and Bradshaw, as well as other officers, were out there taking license plates and running those down and trying to figure out if anybody was there that didn't belong there. They actually planted microphones near the headstone, wondering if somebody would approach at some point, maybe by themselves, and say something that would reveal. They were trying almost anything. This is the Mesquite, and as we'll get into some of these other departments, are very small departments, and they didn't have large resources to devote to these sorts of things, and this had never happened. This sort of a stranger abduction out of nowhere had not happened to Mesquite in the history that they had remembered in some of these other departments. As we'll get to, our killer was good at that. He knew these sorts of things, and so they were desperately trying almost anything that might lead them to the killer. Obviously, it had changed from an abduction, and an abduction where they believed the child was probably dead, to knowing the child had been murdered, and now all they're looking for is a suspect.
Right. Now you jump ahead to February 12th, 1986. Not, less than a year after the abduction of Christie. And you introduce a character, Tiffany Ibarra, who's 10 years old. Tell us a little bit about this story.
Well, Tiffany, she is at this time in an area very close. These areas that we're talking about originally are all in the Dallas area. And Tiffany is walking to school. Actually, she's with some friends early one morning first, and then her clothes are soiled by a bird in a tree or of some sort like that, and so she goes home to change her clothes. And as she's walking to school, she notices a man in a van on the other side of the street at first, who's kind of watching her walking to school. He's in this neighborhood, and he gets out of the car and begins to approach her, and although there's nothing outwardly threatening about him, he's smiling and he's trying to lure this child near. She starts to run, but he catches her fairly quickly and takes her and throws her into his van. At this point, he, for some reason, is talking to her, and he'll later tell another inmate that she was too pretty to kill, but he hands her what was called a bag phone at the time. I don't know if you remember them, I barely do. Is sort of the precursor to cell phones, and tells her to call her mom and tell her mom that she's been abducted. And he allows her to do that, and essentially gets that one sentence out where he grabs the phone back and then tells her, if this ever happens, if I ever see you alone again, next time you won't get away. And then he tells her to leave the van. She leaves and runs home and tells her mom that the stranger had her, and her mom's a little bit not sure, is Tiffany making up an excuse because she didn't want to go to school, or what is this whole wild story? But they do look into it, and they do eventually call the police, and the police take a report, but there's nobody else has reported some stranger lurking in a van in the neighborhood picking up little girls, so they allow it to go with just having taken a report from Tiffany.
Right. Now, 3 days later, and again, what a sad, ironic date, but February 15th, right after Valentine's Day, and this is a heartbreaking portrayal you have in the book too. That what's found is a heart-shaped Valentine's box. Tell us about this, February 15th.
Well, on February 15th in the same neighborhood, actually the same street, though it won't become apparent until later to the cold case detectives, a little girl named Christy Proctor was walking home from a friend's house, and she had her Valentine's Day box that had been given to her by her aunt, and my understanding it was the sort of thing that you would collect those little valentines we used to get when we were kids in school, and she had this box, and suddenly she disappeared, and all they actually find is the box. And once again, we're not talking very late at night or in the dark or anything else. She simply disappears. And both these girls, Tiffany and Christy, were within several blocks of the elementary school that they both attended. So Tiffany, for some reason, this man I've termed the bogeyman, this monster, let her go, and but then continued to hunt in that same area and grabbed Christy Proctor instead.
Now, you explain and convey the attitude of the police at this point as a result of this, and also the panic. We just touched on it a little bit, but now describe that panic, that palatable fear that these people were experiencing.
I'm sorry, did I miss something there at the end, Dan?
Yeah, I said you really described the panic, but I would like you to explain to the audience really what was, as a result of this, what kind of reaction does the community have? It's a small community, and because people are literally disappearing, these children, tell us about what the general environment was and the attitude in that community.
Well, sure. When the police realized that Christy Proctor has also disappeared, and in the same area that Tiffany had, they suddenly realized that there's a predator on the loose who's actively hunting children. And of course, because it is so close to Mesquite, and it's only been a year or so since Christy Meeks had disappeared, that they're starting to draw some correlations between that disappearance, this disappearance, and of course, because of the nature of this, most disappearances, most child abductions are somebody in the family. There's a divorce in the family, and one parent or the other takes the child, or somebody in the family thinks they're rescuing the child from the parents, or even a family friend, and a lot of these get tracked down. But I think people would be surprised that stranger abductions are actually a very small percentage of these. So when you have someone like this who is actively preying on children and doing so in a methodical way around certain areas, certain school areas, certain social economic groups are targeted. I mean, just imagine as a parent that your child is out there. Your child's got to walk to school. You can't necessarily take your child to school every day. You can't walk them home every day. You can't see them to their friends' houses. And this is a neighborhood where some of that had gone on, and children, like children everywhere, will go to friends' houses, and now suddenly it's as if a lion had been turned loose in your neighborhood that was preying on children. But this is a lion that no one sees, one that it could be the guy walking down the street next to you, on the sidewalk across the street, the guy you saw in the store, or the stranger you start looking at every car. You start wondering about that guy who's a little bit odd, who lives in the apartment above you. You start questioning everybody. You question your friends. You wonder who this could possibly be, who could take children during the daylight hours and not be seen, or be seen only by other children. It's in some ways it's like one of those Stephen King books where the adults can't see the monster and only the children can.
Yes. As well, they go through the extraordinary efforts of even hypnotizing these children to try to see if they can glean some, new information.
Right.
And for our audience, too, if you could describe the geography that we're talking about, too, this Interstate 65, basically, has close access to 3 states. And this is well before Amber Alert and police inter-jurisdictional connection, basically, via the Internet. So just tell us about the geography and the the complication that presented with it being access to all these states nearby.
Well, the Dallas area is obviously it's a very flat area with a lot of interconnecting highways. They go north, south, east. It's one of the main connections through that part of the country. And if you think about it, your child's out there, your child's playing. How long before, since when your child has been abducted, does somebody let you know? You go outside, you search, you call some of the neighbors where they go, you ask some of their friends. Somebody says they picked a man picked up your child, and even at that point, are you thinking, well, is it just a friend who was taking them home or whatever? Right. So even connecting with the police can take, quite a bit of time. And right. Then the police respond. They talk to you. They try to get a feel for it. As in the case of Tiffany Ibarra, where they were trying to, the mom had said, well, I'm not sure if she's telling the truth, and so the police are trying to question her to figure out, how much veracity can we give to this report. So they. An hour and a half passes, and on with interstates, how far can you get on an interstate before the alarm even goes off? I mean, and like you said, these are the days before Amber Alerts, so nobody is sending much of anything that way. And this particular monster was very smart about crossing jurisdictional lines, taking a child in one jurisdiction and doing what he was going to do in another jurisdiction and leaving a body in another jurisdiction, with all these, knowing that the police department communications at that time, computers were even then a fairly new thing as far as connecting with each other, and the Internet was, still a dream.
Yeah, ways away. Now, you do now introduce Gary Sweet, like you say, the hero of the story, and really you take us really inside his life, in his mindset, and the work, the incredible work, and really the faithful. And he really believes in. He's a practicing Christian, him and his wife, and a lot of these people here are really deep faith, whether people think that's hokey or not. But it really seems like fate has intervened in everyone's life, the victims and the living, but with Mr. Sweet. So tell us about him and Garland, Texas, near Dallas, and his, sort of untypical rise to a position where he would be this kind of person that he becomes.
Well, yeah, Gary's a very, it's sort of an unusual background. He's not, there are some officers in this where their dads were detectives or they had some other connection to law enforcement, and that's why they got into it. But Gary was mostly looking for a job. He'd lost his job. He had a wife shortly out of high school and a child on the way, and Eventually he went on a ride-along sort of with a friend and thought, well, this might be a good enough job until I can get into something else. He's a big guy and a former kickboxer, actually a very good one, who had some ideas of turning pro with this. And so he gets into the police department, and initially some of it's for the adrenaline rush. He likes that nighttime patrol and mixing it up with the bad guys and that sort of thing. And but Gary, as you noted, he's very devout and becomes more so as he works as a police officer, first on patrol, then he works in the schools, and he has his own children. And he finally becomes a detective, and it's very early in his detective career that he first walks into the Garland Police Department, what they call the murder closet, which is down in the basement. It's where all the cold cases get stored. And he's kind of on his lunch hour, and he decides he would like to go down there, and he just starts kind of going through some of the files and a few of the boxes, and he comes across one, Roxanne Reyes. And he remembers this case because he had actually been on patrol when this little girl was abducted. So he starts reading about it, and as you've noted in the book, Gary believes very strongly that, of all the cases he could have picked up and of all the people who could have been there, and as you know, there are a number of other instances that you have to say, well, that's either fate or karma or God or something working, because just how unusual it was. He believes very strongly that he was directed to start working on this case and to revive this case that had, another case that comes from 1987, the Christy Meeks and Christy Proctor had already disappeared, and this is another case that they believe that this predator had also been responsible for, but that Gary, for one reason or another, he kind of takes an interest in this case, but he's very young, very new detective. He doesn't think that he's even going to be allowed to work on a cold case, so he sort of looks at it and files it back in the box and puts it away for a little while.
Now, he's just looking through that box, like you say, in lunch hour. It's interesting, too, that he takes lunch earlier than everyone else, so he's around so he can have quiet time to do stuff, internet searches. But anyway, he's looking through this box, and there's 100 suspects, but really he hones in on this David Elliott Penton. He reads about this guy anyway, of course. Again, fateful event. But tell us at that time, what he thought. I mean, he looks through this stuff, and concerning David Elliott Penton, what did he read at that time, and what did he know of him, and why did this guy's name kind of stick out a little bit?
Well, the boxes in this case, it wasn't what you might think of as a well done homicide case where everything was filed neatly and little sticky notes and all that sort of stuff. It was actually 2 boxes and mostly a mess. But one of the files in there had a list of suspects, and it just so happened, and call it fate, call it divine intervention, or whatever you want to call it, but the name Penton sort of jumped out at him, not for any particular reason that he knew at the time, other than as he saw this name and he saw that a couple from Columbus, Ohio, the grandparents of Roxanne Reyes had seen a story about a man who had been arrested for a murder of a child up in Ohio. And so he saw this newspaper clipping, and they were saying that the man arrested up in Ohio resembled the police artist sketch of the suspect in the Roxanne Reyes abduction and murder. And that just kind of stuck with him too. But like I said, at that time, and he wondered. He said, there was nothing in the box. Like I said, it was very haphazard. Things were thrown in there. There was nothing in there to indicate whether anybody had followed up on this lead or talked to Penton or talked to the people up in Ohio or anything else. But so he just wondered a little bit at that time if anybody ever had checked to see if Penton was a viable suspect, and he assumed that the other officers ahead of him had done their jobs, and all this had been checked out. But once again, his lunch hour was over, so he kind of packed it all up and thought, well, they're not going to let me do this at my young stage of being a detective. So he put it away and though every once in a while it would come up in his mind, for some reason something kept reminding him of this case, and it would float to the top of his consciousness on occasion. But he did nothing else on it for a couple of years.
Now, something you include everything that really does shape Gary Sweet's development, in this, and prepares him for inevitably having to do some incredible detective work. And again, it looks like the hand of fate intervenes on his behalf more than once, certainly. Now, part of this development is that, like any detective, I don't care what you read, is what you really experience personally in police work, to learn how the criminal, especially the incredible, deviant, aberrant mind of a murderer really works. And so you include the story of the 80-year-old Smiley Johnson murder. Tell us about this and why you included it, and basically, after you tell us, what do you think Gary Sweet learned from that?
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and that detectives are the good detectives in particular. I mean, there's a certain amount of schooling they can take, and they can go to Quantico for the FBI school, and they can read everything, and they can talk to other detectives, and they can go to DNA schools and forensic schools. But the best detectives in my experience, and I've written a number of these books, are they learn from their experiences. And in the case of Gary, and in this particular case, it seemed like some stories, some cases he worked on, were preparing him for his what you might say is his greatest case, this case.
Right.
And the Smiley Johnson case was, Smiley Johnson was an old elderly woman in her 80s, and she's home one night when she's attacked and brutally stabbed. Just a horrific scene there. She's practically gutted. She's stabbed numerous times. Still manages to, after the assailant leaves, drag herself out to her living room, where instead of calling the police, she calls the neighbor from across the street, and the neighbor comes running over, and then they call 911, and she says that a smallish man came to the back door. She thought it might be one of her relatives, and she let him in, and he attacked her. Smiley Johnson's an interesting character in that she's not exactly wasn't your most upstanding citizen and that sort of thing, and didn't like the police too much, and so she doesn't give them much more than the stature of this guy and the possibility that it was one of her relatives, and then she backtracked on that, but she died at the hospital, so it becomes a murder case, and Gary is assigned to this along with his partner. They question a number of people, some of the nephews and sons and grandsons and all these sorts of things, and talk to different people, and at the same time, shortly after Smiley is murdered, a young black woman was also attacked and brutally stabbed. She managed to survive and talk to the police, even though she said her assailant was an older black man. but still being so close in the same neighborhood and the same sort of attack, and some of the footprints led back towards Smiley Johnson's house. They thought something was going on here, but they couldn't figure that out. So they about a year goes by, and Gary hears back from one of the Smiley Johnson's grandsons, I believe, who said that another grandson had confessed to him that he had killed her, that he was into necrophilia and listening to thrash metal bands and that sort of thing, and had done this. And so Gary eventually tracks him down, and through interrogation, the young man confesses, in fact happily confesses, and talks about all sorts of horrific things that he did. And with Gary, the learning process here is sort of understanding human nature. Is like Smiley Johnson obviously knew who attacked her, but why didn't she say who attacked her? Why didn't she point to her grandson as who had done this? And then the young black woman wouldn't come off of her description of her attacker as an older black man, even though it became apparent that the grandson had also committed this crime. And so part of this is, and it's learning how to talk to these guys. It's this young man, and I believe he was 16 when he attacked Smiley Johnson. He's done these horrible things to his grandmother. Says that he loves her, but he wanted to know what it was like to have sex with a dead person and these sorts of things. So imagine having to speak to this person and get as much information as you can so that you can go to court and get them convicted and sent to prison at the very least. And so he learns, part of this is the process of learning how to identify with the killers and be able to talk to them on a level where they will relax and say more than they even know that they're saying, and being able to come across not as a friend necessarily, but as friendly and understanding and these sorts of things, and having to swallow what you really feel and think about this character, this killer in front of you, in order to do your job, so that when it comes to going to court, you can give the district attorney what they need to convict this guy and get him off the streets.
What I also found interesting in this is the crucial part of the questioning is that Gary is so thorough that he thinks about it long and hard, in that he really does believe that there might be a connection, like you say, with the 15-year-old that is accused and has already confessed and says he enjoys it, and similarities with the crimes with his attempted with the black woman. But he asked the black lady, he says, "You said this is a black man, how, but you say you didn't see his face, so how do you know?" Well, she says, "Well, there's 80% black people in this neighborhood." And he said, "Well, how do you know he's old?" "Well, he had those Converse All-Star Chuck Taylor runners. No young guy wears those." So I found it really interesting that we get those kind of details, but that's the kind of police officer so thorough to be able to look at something and then just keep digging.
Yeah, and it's a matter of knowing your case, and that's what Gary in particular impressed me with, is that he was not half-assed, if I can use that term.
Sure.
In anything he did, he knew his case. He knew the details. As we'll, I'm sure, talk about here in a little bit, is that it became very important for him to know the details of so many cases and so much that had gone on, so that he could cross-reference it and ask the proper questions. And that's the sort of, that also comes out of the Smiley Johnson case, as you note, that he's so sure of the details that he's actually able to question the killer when he makes a statement about having had sex with the older woman, Smiley Johnson, and says, she was checked for that, and she didn't, she wasn't sexually assaulted, and so where the young man says, well, I sexually assaulted one of the wounds, which, is the sort of thing it's horrific to listen to and to know these sorts of things go on in the world, but it's what can make the difference between putting somebody away for the rest of their life, which is not going to happen in that case, unfortunately. That young man is actually up for parole this year. But because of his age at the time of the crime. But it is the difference sometimes in being able to thwart any defense attempts at you have the wrong guy or something else like this. It's those small things that put away the big cases.
You know what I found interesting living in Canada, and I apologize for always referencing that, but to me, fellow Canadians must find this shocking because of the difference. In Canada, 15 years old, he was charged. 16, he was sentenced. 15 years old, in Canada, at this present time, he'd be released at 18, period. They could give him 3-year sentence maximum. He'd have some supervision. He'd be walking the streets in 3, not 30. A plea bargain given to this kid was 30, so he's eligible for parole this year.
Eligible for parole this year, and here's the scary part is that somebody with this sort of thinking, the sociopath or the true psychopath, they don't get better. Especially sending them to prison doesn't make them better. If anything, he's in there thinking about how he'll do it better next time and not get caught. Or it's building up in him sort of behind that dam and let him out of prison and the dam's going to break. There is no rehabilitation for that sort of killer. The guy who shoots somebody in a bar brawl, you had too much to drink and that sort of thing, it's understandable, but the sociopath, the psychopath who enjoys killing or feels they have the right to or feels they have the need to, they're not getting better. That young man is going to come out of prison if they let him go, as bad or worse.
Well, and the thing is, there's no manner of programming that conceivably could really help, like you say, the murderous psychopathic killer. But at the same time, can you imagine if his behavior escalated? If he wasn't finished with his fantasy, what would be next?
Well,
he was incredibly shocking. Talking about licking in the intestines and raping the wound. Wow.
Well, and it's very obvious that he's not over his fantasy. They don't get over those fantasies. No. Our main killer in the book, David Penton, he relives his fantasies every day. He likes to talk to them about other inmates. These to them, they were a little bit off track on that. But it's if you don't mind, as sociopaths and psychopaths, they're just wired different. People ask me, well, you've talked to a number of them, you've met and sat across the table from a number of them. What's different? And what's different is, to me, they're not truly human. If what makes us human is empathy and a set of moral values that prevents us from acting in certain ways, is what defines us as human. These people are not human. They're wired differently. They don't see what they do as being wrong. They may know that they have to try to cover it up or do whatever to continue to avoid detection and being caught so that they can continue doing what they're doing. But they are wired to do what they do. It's like asking a lion not to hunt zebras anymore when he's been doing it his entire life. The lion's not going to agree to that. They don't start eating grass.
Yeah. Except it's a conscious decision with the human, not innate wiring.
Sure.
But I agree with you,
well,
everything else.
I would say that there's a certain amount of the innate wiring is that they lack those things in them that tell them this is wrong. They don't see it as wrong. They don't understand, the ones I've talked to anyway, why we actually feel that killing somebody is wrong. And that's when you talk about innate wiring, that's what they're missing, is they know that they'll be punished if they get caught for this, but they don't really understand why we feel that way.
Yeah, it's again, it's an ongoing mystery to the mindset and how people could possibly even fantasize, let alone enact. Now, we talked about Penton, so let's introduce this main character here, our monstrous focus. And again, fate intervenes because Gary Sweet gets a phone call, again, during lunch. And you also describe how often it's just up to the luck of the draw that somebody gets a call to work on a case or gets information or gets these kinds of phone calls. So tell us about the phone call from Tammy Lopez, formerly Tammy Reyes, and what she had said to Gary.
Tammy Reyes is the mother of Roxanne Reyes. Roxanne disappears in 1987 from an apartment complex in Garland, Texas, which is also in that Dallas area. Gary happens to be, as he was, as you noted before, he liked to take his lunches early just out of habit. He used to work as a school resources officer, so he got used to having his lunch at 11 before the kids did, and then at noon he'd be in the cafeteria for the kids' lunches. So he got used to that. And then when he was a detective, he enjoyed it because it gave him some time in the office at noon to have it to himself, be able to use the computer, the newfangled thing called a computer, and some of these sorts of things. So he was alone in the office, and as we all know, S is a little ways down the alphabet. So when a call would come in, not for a specific detective, but for just somebody in the detective unit, the switchboard would first go to the A's and the B's and the C's and the D's and go down the alphabet until they found somebody sitting at their desk. So he was used to sort of they had their desks were set along the walls, the four walls of the detective unit. And so he'd kind of hear the telephone ring for one guy whose name is in front of him, and then next for the B detective, and next for the next detective down the line in the alphabet. And he'd sit there and wait till they'd finally get to an S, and the phone on his desk would ring, and he picked it up. And in this time he happened to pick it up, and it was Tammy Lopez, formerly Tammy Reyes. And she was just asking. She'd heard something. She said about there being something new on her daughter's case. And Gary, and it took him a second because she was going by Tammy Lopez. But when she mentioned Roxanne, he immediately started putting two and two together, and suddenly had. It knew who she was talking about, and because he had been on patrol when Roxanne disappeared, and then two, he had gone down to the murder closet and just happened to look in those files, and the fact that there had not been a whole lot of abductions and murders of small children in this area. And most of the police officers were aware of the name Roxanne Reyes. he was able to put it together. Now, he had not heard of anything new. This is a couple of years after he had been down to the murder closet, and he had not heard of anything new on the case, and told her that and said he would check with the other detectives, though, and get back to her. So he hung up, and then he talked to the other detectives, and they had not heard of anything new, so he called Tammy back up and regretfully told her that there was nothing new that they had heard, and he was sorry for it. And what stuck with him on that one was Tammy, just sort of that lingering sadness he could feel even over the telephone lines for this missing child and this lack of answers, and had this monster been caught? Was he still out there? Was all these questions these families have in these type of situations, and that really stuck with Gary, and it's going to be very important to the case later on.
Yeah. Now you jump ahead to June 2000, and now you describe, Gary, as that no longer is this guy a novice. This guy's a veteran, and he's done dozens of murder cases, and he's had a really high solve rate or prosecutorial rate. So the cases he brings, the prosecutor makes. So he's successful. He's a veteran. He's experienced. And he gets a call from Fort Worth, Texas. And again, another fateful phone call. Tell us what this phone call entails, who's it from, and what's revealed.
Well, once again, it's as you noted, it's fateful. It's he is. It's back on the lunch hour. It's noon. The other detectives who might have got this call are all off to lunch. It's just himself once again back down in the detective unit when the phone starts doing its circuitous route around the room, and he's the only one in there, so eventually it comes to him. And again, this is part of this idea of fate or divine intervention, but it's a detective from Fort Worth, Diane Teft, who is looking into the case of an abducted and murdered girl in that area, and she's been contacted by an inmate named Jeffrey Sunnycalb, who's an inmate in the prisons up in Ohio, and he tells her that he was a cellmate of another inmate named David Penton, who was in prison for the abduction and murder of a young woman a young girl, 10 years old, Nidra Ross, up in Ohio. And the Sunnycalb guy says, well, he's telling me about all sorts of murders, and I've tried to contact some people, and nobody seems to be interested. But he calls Diane in Fort Worth, and he gives her enough about that case that she's interested in talking to him. And as he talks to her, he says, and there's these 3 other cases down there in Texas that you might be interested in. One is Christy Meeks, one is Christy Proctor, another is Roxanne Reyes, and he actually has names to these. And so Diane decides to call Garland and see if anybody over there would be interested in coming over and speaking when this Jeffrey Sunnycalb is scheduled to talk to her again the next day, call from prison. So she asks if somebody would like to come over, and Sweet, kind of remembering the voice of Tammy Lopez, and also these interesting connections to the Reyes case, the murder closet, the being there for the first call, these sorts of things, and then he also recalls the name David Penton as having been in the file, and how he had wondered if somebody had ever followed up on some of that sort of stuff, and its possible connections to the Ohio cases. And so he says, yeah, I'd like to be over there and talk to this guy when he calls up tomorrow.
Now, he assembles he and a couple other guys are pretty excited and go down to meet Sonny Kalb. And what's the conversation like? What happens at that meeting?
Well, first of all, the stuff with Sonny Kalb, because it doesn't connect with Diane's case in Fort Worth, kind of starts to fall apart a little bit. And then was an officer, a detective, who had worked on one of the other cases, the Christy Proctor case, and he's sort of spreading the word that the Sonny Kalb guy can't be trusted, and these sorts of things. And so just about everybody else, and there's a bunch of police officers showed up at a meeting to talk about this, and they all start falling off to the wayside, thinking, well, this Sonny Kalb can't be trusted. This stuff could come from, they glean something out of newspapers, and of course now the internet is starting to come to life and that sort of thing. But Sweet, something tells Sweet, along with a few of the details that Sonny Kalb was ever able to give him, something tells Sweet to just keep after this. So it's actually Sweet who starts to talk to Sonny Kalb, has him calling him collect from the prison. Becomes an almost daily occurrence that Sonny Kalb calls collect, and they talk for 10 minutes. He's only allowed to talk for 10 minutes, and keeps feeding Sweet these details that he starts learning all the cases, not just the Garland case, the Tammy Reyes case, or the Roxanne Reyes case, DeMeek's case, and the Christy Proctor case, and trying to put things two and two together and come up with what he needs to on these sorts of things. So eventually he does go to, he knows he needs help, knows he needs to get into the case files from these other cases, the Meeks and the Proctor case, so he goes to Mesquite, where he runs into Bruce Bradshaw, who was, many years before in 1985, was, along with Bob Holloman, had been working the Christy Meeks case from the beginning. And he knows, Sweet knows that they had difficulty with that case because they could not place Pinton in the Dallas area, and they could not connect him to a car that was seen. But Sweet has been coming up with, I don't want to give the whole detective story away, but has been coming up with some amazing information that he's able to start putting some of this together, and convinces Bruce Bradshaw to join him in the quest to see if this guy Pinton is indeed their bogeyman.
Now, you mentioned Bruce Bradshaw, and he becomes a skeptic, whereas Gary stays interested in what's his name, Sonny Kalb, just because he just has this instinct. Because what I found interesting in the story is that just when I think, oh yeah, we've got our guy, it's revealed by these cops also that there's something called open records. And the evidence is that Sonny Kalb had looked into information was available, and that's what he was giving. So for Gary to have faith in this person took a lot of, because he was being discouraged by other officers and what they had said. But what I found interesting about Gary is that he doesn't even take the word of his fellow officers as much as he questions Sonny Kalb as to why, like they make a claim where, the guy clams up sometimes. So he asks him, how come you clam up sometimes? Each thing was, personally by Gary Sweet, cleared because Sonny Kalb had a pretty reasonable explanation for all that. So again, going that extraordinary effort, Gary got to the truth. It was incredible.
Yeah, it's to me, it's the difference between. It's not to say that all these other detectives were bad,
No.
or something. But it's the difference between the detective who goes the extra mile, is willing to keep an open mind. As you know, there's one detective in the story who went up to talk to Sonny Calb actually earlier. They could have got this guy much earlier and maybe prevented some of these other things from happening, or at least solved some of this for some of the other families much sooner. But he goes up there and Sonny Calb says, well, I'll talk to you, but I don't want to be recorded. So this other detective puts a hidden camera into the room, and it's detected by Sonny Calb. So Sonny Calb stops talking. He doesn't tell him why. He's spotted the camera without telling the detectives that he has. So he stops talking. So this other officer, who ends up being the one who's mostly telling these other officers that you can't trust this guy, he's full of it, and you got it from this and that. Gary at least was willing to keep an open mind and say, well, why did you stop talking, and why did you do these things? And to each of these things, Sonny Calb had a legitimate reason, and the ability, and Sonny Calb's not a nice guy. He's in prison he's a pedophile. So to some detectives, that would mean this is a disgusting person that you can't trust for anything, and I just soon not have anything to do with him. But for Gary, it was a matter of keeping an open mind and finding out was this stuff, and not dismissing things. And Gary is, he's said maybe it's because I was young, or maybe it's because I was being guided to stay on this case. But when other detectives were falling by the wayside, and he stayed with it and kept pressing for these details. And once again, he has a fantastic mind for keeping the details in his head and being able to cross-reference them, saying, it might be some tiny little thing. What kind of shoe was the little girl wearing? In that Penton told me she was wearing a Cabbage Patch doll shoe. Well, some of this stuff wasn't in the public record. And Gary, because he was so familiar with the public, with what had been out in public and what had been kept quiet and these sorts of things, was able to say, that can only come from one person, and that had to come from the killer. And then, of course, from Sonny Calb, as I'm sure we'll discuss, he starts moving on to some of these other inmates.
With Sonny Calb, what did he? I found it interesting that Gary says, well, how exactly did this conversation come up? And then he talks about them watching TV and watching Oprah, and then I'm not sure if it was the Christy Meeks case, or tell us about that, and what kind of character. I mean, of course we know he's a monster, but what were the kinds of things that he would boast about in prison? Not only to Sonny Calb, but other people as well. But what did Sonny Calb say in terms of what was really his character like, in terms of the things he liked to talk about and boast about?
Well, essentially, Penton around other inmates, it doesn't matter what the conversation can be about the World Series, and Penton will eventually turn it around to raping and murdering little girls. And he likes to relive them. He fantasizes about them. He likes to recall them. He likes to recall them in detail. Which is probably his undoing, in that he remembered names and he remembered small details, and all of this was wonderful for him to recall and regale his fellow inmates with this thing. And all these guys in this case are in the segregated unit, which is where the pedophiles are, but it also happens to be where some former police officers who have run afoul of the law are in there as well. But so he's sort of, if it was general population and he's bragging about raping and murdering little girls, he's not going to do so well for very long. But in this situation, he's among other pedophiles, even if none of the rest of them are quite as vicious and monstrous as he is. So he gets off on it. He's this is sexually exciting to even talk about it. He's in prison. He can't do this to any more little girls while he's in prison, though there's a chance he'll get out, and he talks about, if they let me out of here someday, he was going to change some of his modus operandi and how he does things, but he was still dreaming of doing the same thing, and that's his personality, is to brag and boast and relive all of this.
Now, in terms of the other part I thought was interesting too is that we almost see what we often see in true crime is you can't write fiction like this in terms of everyone, and then the author really uses it as a device because we're all sucked along into this journey. Sometimes the DNA doesn't match, and so we really have further disbelief from many officers because and tell us whose DNA was tested and there was no match for, which led them to believe that Sonny Cobb was lying and that Penton really wasn't their man for many of these murders, including the 3 that he had mentioned.
Well, what it was more than anything, they actually went to the home in Columbus, Ohio, where Penton had lived with his mom for a period of time. Penton actually had murdered his own son, shook him to death, even prior to Christy Meeks' disappearance, which is why generally it's believed that he's killed before Christy Meeks and many more than he's ever been accused of. But when Sweet had been told by Sonny Cobb that Penton had once told him that if you want to hide something, stick it in the insulation of the attic of your house, because police officers aren't going to spend that kind of time or effort to get into that. So, of course, Sweet and Bradshaw and a couple of these other guys that are involved, Billy Meeks and Don Phillips, they went over to this house, and there was somebody else living there now, and they had a warrant. They went up into the attic and actually found a group of rags that had been tied, particularly in a bundle in the insulation in the attic. Obviously had been placed there for a reason. But this is, I think by now we're talking 2001, 2002, so it's been 7 years stuck in an attic. And the DNA had, and there was evidence of saliva and blood, and I believe some semen on these rags, but it had degenerated to such a degree, and once again, right. Today would those rags maybe be able to be connected in 2014? DNA every year is taking enormous leaps forward, but this is 2002, so it was still fairly new. And at that point, they had to say that it didn't rule out Roxanne Reyes or Penton, but it wasn't going to be strong enough to use in court. They were not going to be able to stand up there and say 1 in a billion or anything else like that. It was too had been too long and too old, and the science wasn't advanced enough at that time.
Now, the reason why he's in prison, and so we have this captive, and so they know where he is this Nidra Ross. Tell us about the murder of Nidra Ross.
Well, Penton, as we get to know him in the book, is very clever. I've mentioned that he would take children just off the streets, to complete strangers, low-income areas where the political forces and the social forces to do something about it are less, unfortunately, then they might be in a wealthier area. In fact, he used to call these kids throwaway kids. Then he would cross jurisdictional lines and deposit the bodies in other jurisdictions to confuse the police officers, and that's why these Texas murders, and up to 25 to 50, if you go by his boast, other murders have gone, if not completely undetected, then are unaccounted for, then having difficulty putting cases together. But in the case of Nigel Ross, he happened to be working with Nidra's uncle, was over at the house partying the night before, was seen talking to the little girl the next day, and then all of a sudden she disappeared. He was a suspect fairly quickly, as he was the last one seen with her. There was some blood found in his van, his white van. Once again, DNA wasn't strong enough. This was approximately 1988, and DNA testing and blood testing at that time was still not very good. He was a suspect, but they couldn't put the case together, and it took them actually several years to put the case together, but they eventually did, and convicted him of murder up in Ohio without the death penalty, and also with the possibility of parole here in, I believe, 2027. He's eligible, though, as we all know, that can change, and time off for good behavior, and laws change and all that sort of stuff. So he's not necessarily in for life, which was why some of these other cases became important. But he had made a mistake. It might have been his only real big mistake that didn't take a detective as good as Gary Sweet to catch him on, even though it did take him 3 years to put the case together.
What I found interesting, we did skip over it in terms of making the audience realize this, is that he has the shake his own baby, and but tell us about the escape, and in terms of what we now know, what could have possibly been prevented if?
Well, we know that 4 little girls might have still been alive. In 1984, Penton, he was married and had a young, an infant son, and apparently the baby was crying, and he shook the child so hard that the child died, and he ended up being charged with manslaughter in that case, and this was 1985, so essentially he gets out, he's charged, but he gets out on bail, and during this time is when Christy Meeks first disappears, and then in May, when he's supposed to be sentenced, he takes off and on the manslaughter charge for his son. He was a judge had allowed him out on an appeals bond on the case instead of putting him away, and so he's out. So Christy Meeks disappears during this time. Christy Proctor disappears during this time. Roxanne Reyes disappears during this time, and Nigel Ross disappears, and of course all those girls were eventually found. Their remains were found, and they'd been murdered. So there's 4 little girls, and there are those of us, Gary, myself, and some other law enforcement are working on some other cases who believe that a number of other murders occurred during this time. That, granted, if he's in on manslaughter, he's not going to be away for the rest of his life or anything else like that. But perhaps those little girls at least would have not been there for him to prey upon and whether he got out of prison and attacked other little girls, he's probable. So on that, but you never know. Something could have happened to him in prison, or he could have confessed to some other crime and been convicted while still in prison. So yes, allowing him to go free on an appeals bond during this period of time directly resulted in the death of some other little girls, and perhaps being able to put him away for life at that time without ever jeopardizing anybody else.
What's another ironic, it's just another sad, tragic feature of this is that he was married a couple times and had kids, and so he has a sad legacy as well with family members, part of the carnage, I guess, too.
Yes, and I use it to describe Penton in the book that someone like this and the things that he does, it's a huge ripple effect. He casts a stone into the pond, and it's not just that child that he murders, but their families, the people who loved them, and beyond them, the people that we never even think about in these the police officers who become so emotionally and psychologically involved in these cases, and particularly men who have their own children, and they work all day trying to solve the murder of some child, and then they go home and there's their children playing and laughing and having dinner and growing up, and these little girls, they get to watch their own children grow up to graduate high school and get through college and begin their own lives, and yet these men continue to work on stories of little girls whose lives ended when they were 5 years old or 6 years old or 7 years old, and that's an enormous toll. And then you think about their families, where as you know, there's the story of Bob Holloman and what it did to him and his family, and even when they're there, even when they're home with their families, they're thinking about these other children, and I think there's some guilt that they deal with from their home, and they get to see their children and get to enjoy their children, and yet they know, and maybe that day talk to some parent who is grieving and asking for questions, and why haven't we caught this guy, and how could someone do this to children? I have an enormous respect for some of these detectives, and particularly for the pain and the suffering they go through, in addition to the people that it's obvious to us who are suffering.
Yeah, you describe early on, and again, we didn't mention this, but again, another striking part of your book is this event where I believe it's Bob Holloman's wife finds Bob in a closet with a gun, in terms of, talk about a breakdown in terms of psychologically. Was it Bob Holloman's wife that found him? Yes,
Molly. He's, some officers, it affects them all. I don't know. In this particular case, maybe there's the sort of officer who it's just a job, but not the guys I'm describing in this book. But some are able to put it on the shelf when they leave the department, and even though they take some of it home with them, they are able to put it aside for a little bit and be the family men that they want to be at home. Bob, unfortunately, could not let it go. Couldn't put it aside, and it wore on him, and in a very tragic way. And that's one of the stories is that a few years into it, Molly found him at home in the closet with a gun and sobbing, and essentially just torn apart, that he could not, first, it tore him apart in those early days, that he could not save this little girl, and then that he could not catch her killer.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is, I found interesting too, and a very vivid portrayal that you do have in the book about Gary bringing home Cannibal Corpse. I rented out a room one time. I saw the cover of Cannibal Corpse. It's an incredible horror show. You can't believe our group's putting an album out like this. But Cannibal Corpse and Slayer, and he did the research to realize that this kid kept referencing 213, and that was a Slayer song. His wife, a devout Christian, said, you can't bring that stuff into the house. So right. What I found really interesting is that these guys are some of the loneliest cops ever, because they can really only talk to a couple people, which means a couple cops. Because you can't even talk to the average cop. You can't talk to your wife. You can't bring it home. You can't talk to your kids. It's a lonely life. And what's interesting to me, and even more horrific, if faith didn't intervene and this guy didn't make extraordinary efforts and take the work home with him and jeopardize his home life, we'd be none the wiser. And who knows?
And, you know, and some people have said, well, you know, this Pinson character, he's in prison, and, you know, even if he gets out, he'll be older. You know, of course, that ignores that we have, you know, our justice system is rife with people getting out earlier than they supposedly will, and laws changing, and decisions being made to allow certain people out, and those sorts of things, as well as escapes and stuff like that. But you know, that to me, that's not even the entire point here. Is that yes, he's a danger, and he will always be a danger, even if, you know, another 20 years from now the courts decide that well, maybe he's not a danger anymore, and release him to do his own thing. But it's these families who deserve answers. They deserve to know who took their child. They deserve to know that he is off the streets. Excuse me. They deserve to know that he's being he's paying for his crimes. Excuse me. Let me get a drink here.
Yes, I agree too, because I hear the similar refrain here. Well, you know, you don't expect them to be in there forever, and there's programs and anger management, and psychopathic killers that have glee and wallow in there and revel in their crimes and write letters, contact the media, brag and boast, want to relive their crimes. I'm sorry. There has to be a place, a special place, for these type of persons to live and reside forever. And that is for the public, but especially for the victims' families. They shouldn't have to worry about a parole hearing, whether it's a slim possibility or not. They shouldn't have to worry that this person could be, like you say, a more medium security and he might escape. And even sympathy for these monsters. It's just, I'm sorry, I don't have any, we shouldn't have any, and we should just have a special place where we lock them away forever.
Well, and I can agree with that. That's I've met enough of them to know that they don't get better. And I guess the point I was trying to make beyond that is that it's not enough to say, well, okay, he's in prison for however long, even if we had one of those special places where they go forever and that sort of thing. Is there David Penton? As you know, there are other cases in the book than we've discussed. There are cases being investigated right now that may be added to the book or added to a future update of the book. But these are the children whose remains have been found, and these are the children who detectives like Gary Sweet and Bruce Bradshaw, and up in Indiana, Jeff Heck and some others have been able to put together enough to say this is the killer of an abductor of your child. But there are families out there who don't know. There are families, I've talked to families who 20 years later still set a place at the dinner table for that child who disappeared. Who, as we know in the one case in the book, and can leave that one for the readers, but a woman came along many years later who claimed to be their daughter. There are these families who don't have answers to what happened, and they deserve those answers. So to say that, well, he's away and he's in prison and he may or may not get out is not enough. Not when with some work and some detective work and some resources, we can give some answers to some of these families who are waiting, and keep that place at the dinner table or the light on in the back, hoping that the child comes home someday.
Yeah, it's certainly not closure, but it's the little semblance of, I guess, dignity or hope, something that the families cling to, that they need that conviction. They need answers because they have nothing but unanswerable questions and heartache and loss. And so I applaud the despite the tight budgets, despite even when I see some of these killers in prison convicted for life without the possibility of parole, there are still officers and jurisdictions that want justice for those other families, regardless of the outcome going to make any real difference. He's doing life anyway. That it's still closure for those families and what they really do deserve, and what the public, what we pay for. We pay for dearly for this. So I applaud that effort to make sure as many people get the answers to where their loved ones went and who and why. Just some answers to their questions.
I agree completely. It's not closure, but it is answers. And if any one of us who is a parent, if you thought about it for a few minutes and something like this happened to you, you would want those answers too. Because imagine what these parents go through. Are you a bad child? You let your child out of your sight for a few minutes. They end up these things destroy marriages. They destroy families. People talk behind your back, even your own families. What sort of a failure were you as a parent? When what we don't understand is, somebody like Penton is a predator. He's stalking. He's waiting. He's using his mind to find those times when, I don't care what kind of a parent you are, he's waiting to strike. And yet these people have to live with for the rest of their lives, what did I do wrong? How bad was I as a parent? And then, the possibility of some of us, including Gary and myself and some other officers, are hoping that at some point some prosecutor will hold the death penalty over David Penton, who would desperately do anything to save his life if possible, and maybe confess to some of these other crimes, and even give parents or police officers an idea of where he left these children. Because, as I said, these children had their remains were found. At least their parents had their remains to bury. They have remains to mourn over. And some people don't believe in all that or care about that part of it, but to some people that's what they have left. It's a cold tombstone, but it's an even colder tombstone if there's nothing buried underneath it. So the possibility of knowing that your child isn't left in the woods somewhere, or there's a lot that can be done and should be done if we care for what happened to these other people, these other families.
Yeah. Well, part of it is getting these kinds of stories out, and I applaud you for a fantastic book. Bogeyman is it'll scare the hell out of you, rip your heart out. But for all those true crime readers out there and fans of true murder, I know that this is the kind of story they really are affected by. Now, speaking of books and being affected by books, you have an announcement to make. You are a best-selling true crime author with some of the kinds of titles that, again, would be worthy of coming on this program because it's the most shocking killers in true crime history. How many true crime books do you have to date? And tell us about this new, exciting development that should interest our audience to a great degree.
Well, yeah, thanks. I appreciate you mentioning that. Some of us, when I say us, other true crime authors, we're getting to the point where we've decided to form a publishing company that is run as a consortium of authors. It's called Wild Blue Press. It'll be at wildbluepress.com, where we will be publishing our own books, and they'll be available on Kindle and the other e-readers as well as by print. Right now we are a couple of weeks still from launching the site. It's under construction, but if anybody's interested in either Bogeyman or any of these others, they can write to us at info@wildbluepress.com and get on our list, and we'll let them know as soon as the site is up, and Bogeyman will be available in early June. But we're pretty excited about it just because it's getting harder and harder to convince publishers that true crime readers are a very loyal and a very dedicated group of readers. I also write in biographies and histories and even do some fictional crime thrillers, but I think that one of the most dedicated groups of readers out there are the true crime readers, and
Absolutely.
They're certainly, to me, in many ways, the most fascinating group of readers because they're all into the psychology of these and into the storytelling. But traditional publishers these days don't recognize that, and unless it's a celebrity crime or some crime that Jodi Arias type that has all sorts of little twists like that, as opposed to just a good, solid detective story. Or I keep telling people that In Cold Blood would never be published these days under the traditional crime publishers' demands. So we're a number of us, and I'm a couple of weeks. I'd be happy to come back on in a couple of weeks and let you know. But of us are forming this company. The names are quite recognizable, and some of them have been on your shows. And we'll be.
Can you name a few?
Well, I have to wait for 2 more weeks to be able to do that, and I promise you'll be the first to know, Dan, and I'll let you know. But it's a matter of getting our ducks in order and making sure that all these things. But the idea is that we believe true crime readers are a large group and a strong group, and that if we offer them good quality true crime books, then we will, this publishing company will do well and satisfy both the readers and allow those of us who believe true crime books are important. They're important to the culture and to understanding what makes these people tick, out there. So Wild Blue Press will be putting these books out, and I'd just like to also, you've been very kind to let me come on your show, but if it wasn't for people like you and Burl Bear and Aaron Horible and some of the other blog talk radio guys, we'd be just trying to get the word out would be very tough for true crime authors right now. So I know on behalf of all of us, we'd like to thank you guys for, you put a lot of time and a lot of effort into something that, a lot of people enjoy, and I don't know if entertainment is the right word for true crime, but it's
sure.
It's it's important, and I think you're doing a very important job that some other people have failed to do. So I wanted to thank you myself for that.
Well, I knew in my own mind that there was an audience, and people could call it a niche audience, but this show is really big in Australia. It's big in America, and I get fan mail that's I can't believe how rabid the fans are of the program and how nice, extolling all the compliments. And I say, hey, I'm having a great time interviewing the best authors in the world about some of the most incredible crimes that have ever occurred, and it's history. I see true crime as just true history. And just with maybe the crime focus, but you don't just get a concentration on the crime anyway. So not only do I think it's important, but I agree with you that it seems that the traditional publishers, since the shakeup in 2008, have lost their minds in terms of this dedicated true crime audience that was looking for more than a wife kills a husband and a husband kills the wife. There's nothing wrong with some of those stories, but it's not like the audience is getting more gun-shy, and it's not like the audience is getting and dumbing down the audience. I find this to be a very, very bright, informed, passionate audience. So I applaud you for having a publishing company that deals with the authors themselves, putting out books by the authors themselves. You don't need a big chain of people taking all the profit either. And maybe some of that profit might just go to the deserving authors. And the authors and an author-run publishing company will know what books really should be presented out to the audience, and the audience will respond accordingly, I think. So I don't even think I have to wish you any kind of good luck. The word will get out, and the authors will bring the fans in, and you'll have a successful publishing company. And it's about time the authors took hold of their own promotion and distribution and everything else, because really you and Amazon are partners, and now everyone in the world can have a copy one way or another of these kinds of books, and these stories are captivating to people throughout the world. So again, thank you very much for coming on the program, talking about it, and we're excited to have you back on and talk about the new initiative and the new publishing company, and reveal some of those authors and some of the books that are coming down the pike. So I want to thank you, Steve Jackson.
Much appreciated, and we really appreciate the readers. Like you said, they're voracious readers. I don't think I know another genre where people buy 6 or 10 or 12 books at a time and read them. And I wonder where they have all the time. But more power to them. And both you and I and the other authors, where are we if we don't have these readers? So that's much appreciated too. But anyway, thank you, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Steve. So have a great night, and hope to talk to you real soon.
We will.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Good night.